All right, welcome back to the virtual stage at the Good Food Institute India's Smart Protein Summit 2020. I hope everybody had a good break and you're ready to dive into more exciting discussions about building the future of food together. Now, within that future, GFI India believes that tapping into indigenous and diverse sources of ingredients is not only an imperative, but it's also a superpower. I'm super excited to show you exactly why with this discussion, titled 10 Years in the Making, a case study in environmental and social sustainability. That case study is the really fascinating company Terviva, and we have with us today its founder and CEO, Naveen Sikka. Terviva is an agriculture technology company that's focused on building the world's most sustainable supply chain of plant protein and vegetable oil for innovative food product applications. It's a truly fascinating company that I believe you're going to love hearing more about. And a bunch of major publications and institutions agree with me because Naveen's work with Terviva has been celebrated pretty much everywhere you can think of. The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the World Resources Institute, you name it. And what's really exciting is, as with many of the leaders in the global alternative protein sector, Terviva is just getting started. And we expect them to be a key player in our shift from scarcity to abundance over the next decade. But it all really starts 10 years ago, fascinatingly enough, with an ancient crop which has been widely utilized for fuel and medicine. I'm sure I've piqued your curiosity enough with all of that preamble. So I'm just going to go ahead and welcome Naveen Sikka to the Smart Protein Summit. Naveen, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Varun. Great to be here with you today at the conference.
Awesome. Naveen, I'm going to just cut to the chase, okay? So Terviva has already had a 10-year journey building a supply chain and applications for a hero ingredient that was initially focused on biofuels and now on food innovation. Could you reveal to the audience what that ingredient is and talk about how you and the company got to where it is today?
Absolutely. Varun, we make plant protein right here, and we make vegetable oil from the Pangamiya tree, or the Karanja tree, or the Honge tree, or the Bungu tree, depending on where you are in India. This plant protein and vegetable oil, as you indicated, has strong interest from leading consumer food companies here in the United States, where I am, because first of all, these ingredients are tasty, very, very tasty. Second, formulation-wise, functionally, these ingredients have interesting properties that make them unique from other ingredients that are out there. On the vegetable oil side, things like palm and canola and sunflower. On the protein side, ingredients like yellow pea and soy. We're different, and we're advantageously different. Third thing, Pongamiya protein and vegetable oil are affordable. And that really speaks to how we grow these trees here in the United States, how they're currently already grown in farming communities in India. And the fourth thing is the sustainability, as you indicated. Pangamiya protein and vegetable oil, they are carbon negative. And that's because of the history of this tree. So you would ask, Varun, what's our story? How did we start this thing 10 years ago? How did we get to this point? It's a very simple starting story. Myself, my journey, I have a background in the food and ag space. I have a background in agriculture. So in the 10, 12 years prior to starting Terviva, I worked in the agriculture space. In fact, roughly about 22 years ago, I found myself spending a summer in West Africa, where I was looking at various agriculture projects that the US government had set up in West Africa. So fast forward to 10 years later, or 10 years ago, I had heard about the Pangamiya tree as a potential biofuel crop that would grow on poor quality agriculture land, because the Pangamiya tree, as it was in India, was known to grow in reforestation type contexts on difficult to farm lands, soils, and then produce these beans that had a lot of vegetable oil in them, where the history was that the vegetable oil was used in Ayurvedic and Eastern medicine type applications. And now people were saying, hey, could this be a really great biofuel crop? So Terviva started 10 years ago thinking about how we would really need to change agriculture to make it better for the farmer and better for the environment. And we would need to focus on not just food, but feed and bioenergy as well. And the easiest thing when we saw the Pongamiya tree, which we were really enamored by because it was so hardy and so beautiful, was that we could start with biofuel. So we did. And we very specifically worked with varieties of the Pangamiya tree coming from Australia. It's another place where Pongamiya is very commonly found. There was a research group out there that had identified specific trees, Pangamiya trees, that would yield very well in the hardest of conditions. And we brought specimens of those trees to the United States, to Florida, which is a state in the United States that is a big farming state. And in that particular region, there was an opportunity because the historical crop there, which was a orange tree, citrus trees, had a lot of difficulty. They had lost about 500,000 acres of citrus farming land to a disease that was affecting those citrus trees. So we went in 2012 to farmers there in Florida, and we said, why don't you plant the Pongamiya tree? We think it's going to be good for biofuel. And that's how it all got started here in the United States. So I'm going to fast forward to about 4 years ago. 4 years ago, we had demonstrated to these farmers in Florida that the Pongamiya tree was growing well. We had shown you can make it into biofuel. And two things happened in 2016. First was I started to look at the potential of this crop in India. More specifically, I'm Indian by background. Of course, I was very interested in seeing how we could bring that opportunity back to India. And we were thinking about it from a biofuel context, and we were thinking about this protein at the time because we didn't know much about it yet. We were thinking about it as animal feed because that's also a thing that's necessary in India. So I remember having a conversation with the CEO of one of India's leading food companies, and I'm not going to name that person. And I was telling him about the opportunity for Pongamiya and the fact that we could use this vegetable oil for biofuel, and we could use this protein for livestock feed. And he listened very carefully, and he thought it was an interesting idea. And he said to me, you know, Naveen, people need food too. Have you looked at whether or not Pongamiya can be made into human food yet? And the simplicity of his comment really struck me. The second thing that happened was that my lead investor here in the United States, we're a venture-backed company, my lead investor in the United States said something very similar to me. He said, you know, the highest social and economic value that comes out of agriculture is going to always be from food. So we should really try to explore whether these bitter beans that have never really been brought majorly into the food supply could be used for food. So we raised another investment round at that time, and we began to explore what was causing this bitterness in Pongamiya beans. Why was it only being used in Ayurvedic medicine in terms of being consumed and not really used into mainstream food? And I'll fast forward again, Varun, and say we got, it's a combination of good science and good luck that we were able to invent food grade processing to debitter Pongamiya beans in the processing and make this really delicious, functional, affordable, carbon negative vegetable oil and protein. And so that's the story, Varun, of what's happened in the last 10 years.
Super exciting. And Naveen, as you said, Pongamiya, or Karanja as it's known in Ayurveda, it has been revered in Chinese and Indian medicine for thousands of years, and particularly in those Ayurvedic recipes and in biofuels, etc. The piece that's truly exciting about the Pongamiya tree, though perhaps in the context of this conversation, is what you mentioned earlier. What a breakthrough it might represent for the way in which we could reimagine the production of food. There's obviously a lot of work underway to make food systems more circular, less extractive, and we're having this conversation against that backdrop. Could we, would you please dive in a little bit and tell us a little about why Pongamiya is such a sustainability hero?
Yeah. It's a great point. And it really is the foundation of what gets the Terviva team up in the morning to do what we do. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future, but I'll cautiously say one thing that's certain is that the climate is going to change and it's going to become more erratic, and we're going to need a broader set of crops to meet our food needs. And those crops are going to have to be capable of withstanding that erratic cultivation. That is the Pangamiya tree. Right now in India, there are hundreds of millions of these trees that have been planted effectively for climate remediation purposes. The tree is very popular in reforestation projects in and around central and southern India, where it's grown on degraded soils, in some cases saline soils, in many cases without really any available supplemental moisture and very low rainfall. It's used as a border tree on road embankments and around fields. It's often found as a soil stabilizing tree in different kinds of conditions around mining sites and unstable soils. So to start with, Pongamiya as a legume tree, as a hardy tree that is drought tolerant and monsoonally adapted, is very, very tough to begin with. What that means when, and Pangamiya is already harvested in India for its beans by smallholding farmers, what that means is that the beans that come off this tree are very low input. The tree itself is a nitrogen fixer. They're often unfertilized. When you take the beans and when you use our processing methods, which are very gentle and very low in their energy intensity, when you use those processing methods, the resultant ingredients have an incredible life cycle footprint of carbon, right? And then, of course, if you just kind of go back to it, they still have that connection to those smallholding farmer communities. That's where these trees are grown. So it really is a great environmental and social story around the current landscape of Pangamiya.
Naveen, let's dive a little bit deeper on the question of the supply chain as well. We've talked about how you're building the world's first organic fair trade Pongamiya supply chain in India with considerable potential benefits for local communities and your partners. And you've actually pursued a few different models here, which are very interesting. And they include, interestingly enough, tribal populations. The Karanja beans have long been harvested wild by those tribal populations as fuel or for Ayurveda. And now you're focused on building a robust supply chain that rewards those communities as well. I think we'd love to hear more about the process of building up that supply chain. I think you need to scale from a few hundred tons of beans currently collected to tens of thousands of tons. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's the plan. Yes. So a couple of concepts there, Varun. First, foundationally, if we're going to do what I hope we'll do, which is adapt our food system to a climate-constrained future, farmers are going to have to be at the center of that. We're going to have to ask farmers to do things differently than they do it today, work with different kinds of crops, farm them a little bit differently, right? So that means that if you want to make farmers to try to do something different, you have to give them the economic incentive to do it. So one of the reasons why we've chosen to work directly with these smallholding farmers rather than working with merchants who are aggregating Pangamiya beans already is because we want to bring the stewardship practices of Pangamiya to those farmers themselves. We want to include them in the economic equation. We want to enrich their lives by having them directly connected with Terre Viva in making this food. So that's the foundational concept. Then the second sort of concept is, how do you actually scale this, right? Because Pangamiya is everywhere and it's delicious and nutritious, and it can much more readily substitute for things like canola oil and palm oil that are imported, and we can create domestic resilience in India, but you have to get a lot of scale to do that. So scale means you have to have a way to work with these farmers that's truly dynamic. So we do it in two ways. One is we form partnerships. We announced earlier this summer that, for example, this past year, we worked with Dahat to source Pangamiya beans in a particular region where Dahat was already working. We have a couple of other partners who are already working in certain regions with farmers, NGOs, as well as profit-oriented companies that are already working in certain regions where they're familiar with Pangamiya to begin with. And we now are going to tell them more about what we do, and we're going to enable them to procure more supply so we can make it into food. The second element to scaling supply is actually technology. You mentioned how we're sourcing this as fair trade and organic. That only happens if we have something called a traceability system in place, meaning we're working with a technology layer to identify where these beans are coming from, we're logging it, and we're tracing it through the supply chain. This year, we did that work with a company that's very active in India called SourceTrace. And we also used a payment system so we could directly pay the farmers digitally for the work they did. So if you combine the idea of partnerships with technology and you lay that over on the existing robust Pangamiya supply chain that exists in India, you can cut the farmers in more on the deal, give them more economics and incent them to work with you. And you can also create all the measurements of sustainability that you would want to have from a more modern supply chain.
I think, Naveen, you mentioned a little bit in there about the innovative food applications that you have developed, right? Including the processing you've invented as well as the end products. I'd love to hear more about that because you've said in the past about how your innovative food applications are what allow you to deliver the value you're aiming to deliver to your sourcing partners, such as tribal populations. And I think this is absolutely key because with a lot of the work that we're doing at GFI India and our partners are doing more broadly, we're attempting to unlock the potential of indigenous crops, but you do need a high growth, lucrative market to sell those crops into. You can't build a value chain that leads nowhere. You may not even get farmers to switch away from less sustainable crops unless you're able to do that. Alternative protein is really at the forefront of food innovation right now. So the potential to plug farmers into that high growth, lucrative end market and get a better price for their produce is really great. So you have a wonderful applications team at Viva, which is making these innovative food products from Pongamiya. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, how that all comes together and what these products do and how they translate, especially into the alternative protein sector?
Absolutely. Let me just pop up some slides here to show you how we think about that. This is a close-up of the Pangamiya vegetable oil. I'll just talk about it briefly and then get to the protein. It's been really fun, in particular in the last year, to discover what these food ingredients can be used for, the protein and the vegetable oil, in different kinds of food applications. First, just very briefly on the vegetable oil, people have likened the color, Varun, to ghee here in the United States, which is becoming an increasingly popular ingredient. It does have an interesting buttery taste while still being quite light. It finishes very cleanly on the mouth. So first and foremost, we think this can be a direct cooking oil. It has a lovely ability to be used in cooking, and it's got a great application there. We've also discovered that it adds lovely texture and juiciness as a vegetable oil and plant-based meats as compared to the canola oil and sunflower oils that are very commonly used in large quantity. And because of both the color and the taste, it has a very interesting application in plant-based butters or margarines, which are a much more shelf-stable way of delivering that kind of product throughout the world. Let me advance the slides here. This is the protein, the referenced protein that you mentioned, Varun. It has a number of very interesting attributes. It's got great amino acid composition. It is got a lovely color, and it's usable in a variety of applications. But there are two standout pieces of functionality that we really like about the protein isolate in this case. One, as you see, it's very, very highly soluble, very uniquely soluble compared to other plant proteins. And that combines with a low viscosity, which means that when you incorporate Pangamiya isolate into certain kinds of applications, you can put a lot of protein in because it solubilizes, and you get a very light consistency in it. So for example, think about powdered protein beverages or protein beverages. You can put a lot more protein in. You can have it dissolve very cleanly, so less kind of chalky, milky kind of color, more clear kinds of color, and you have a very lighter kind of mouthfeel to the beverage because of the viscosity. So we think about that two ways. Of course, again, in plant-based foods, you can incorporate a lot of protein into plant-based foods and make it very lovely. There's a nutritional aspect here too, right? Protein fortification in various parts of the world, including in India, is a very important thing to improve the nutritional quality of diets. And in this case, you can do that with a native ingredient that has a lovely, light, nutty taste, almost a neutral taste, and a light color, and you get a lot of protein into the application in a very nutritionally useful way. So those are the highlights on the food applications. We're working currently right now here in the United States with some of the leading global consumer product food companies, as well as some of the leading attacker brands in these categories that I mentioned: plant-based meats, plant-based dairy, and beverages.
It's incredibly cool, Naveen. Could you show us the oil and the protein that you have? I see the oil right there, I think, next to you.
Varun, here's the oil. It's our we call it golden Pangamiya oil here in the US. It's got this lovely color. and we'll have to get you and your audience some as soon as possible, so you can start using it and cooking with it. And I'll share one fun fact, by the way, on the protein. This is the protein, the protein ingredient. There's a flour version of this protein. So, before we do the protein intensification to make an isolate. And one of our food technologists here at Terviva is actually Indian by background, Keshav Vadlamani. And he actually took the flour and he made a 50% Pangamiya flour, 50% atta, or Indian flour chapati. And he said it both sheeted well, meaning it rolled out well, and crucially, it fluffed. It fluffed. And I won't get too much into the flour ingredient here, but the flour itself, which is roughly about 38% protein, has very, very interesting functional properties as a bread wheat flour substitute without the gluten.
Yeah, and I think, for the audience, a lot of what Naveen is describing is really fascinating, because a lot of these food applications are quite interrelated with each other. The properties that Naveen described in terms of the solubility, or even the rise that you get when you bake a piece of bread, all of that is quite applicable within plant-based meats and other products, right? Like a plant-based egg or a beverage. There are a lot of these properties that interrelate with each other and are really fascinating and can unlock a whole slew of food applications, which is really great. Naveen, you mentioned you're already working with partners in the space, in plant-based meats, as well as the food system more broadly. What kinds of partners are you looking for, perhaps in India or elsewhere in the developing world, as you continue to build out your vision?
It's a great question. We think about it in a few different ways. There's sort of three main components to our business, Varun. First, and really principally, we are an agriculture company, and so everything starts with the tree. And there's Pongamiya is centered in India in terms of its genetic diversity. And by the way, we have a great team of agronomists and crop geneticists just to understand the Pangamiya tree. At some point, it's probably not the first thing we're going to do in India, but at some point we want to begin to look at Pangamiya in India based on what we know about Pangamiya's vegetable oils and storage proteins for protein ingredients. We want to begin to look at Pangamiya anew and determine, are there varieties of Pangamiya that should be favored over others for the purposes of making food? Because historically, really, there's been no focus on developing Pangamiya varieties for food. So that's one area of partnership we're interested in exploring. Second area, obviously, is around manufacturing food ingredients, producing vegetable oil and protein. Mentioned earlier, we have developed a series of patents and a lot of intellectual property around the manufacturing of these ingredients into food. And we're always interested in talking to oilseed equipment manufacturers and other people who participate in the oilseed ecosystem already in India. So we can use their expertise to set up the manufacturing of Pangamiya in India. And then the third element is, of course, the consumer-facing side of Pangamiya protein and vegetable oil. And I've learned a little bit in the last couple of years about the incredibly exciting attacker brands, new startups that are delivering plant-based foods and nutritional foods into the India market. In some cases, Varun, using some of India's other exciting native crops like sorghums and millets. And we're very interested in, of course, engaging there, as well as with the bigger companies that I think have recognized the need, the interest from consumers to deliver a more diverse set of nutrition and sustainability outcomes onto the consumer plate.
Really exciting stuff, Naveen. I want to zoom out. This is my final question to you. I want to zoom out once again. You've been a company that's 10 years in the making. The theme of our conference this year, the Smart Protein Summit, is to think through how we scale from, or get from, scarcity to abundance in India and other parts of the developing world, particularly when it comes to alternative protein over the next decade. So you're 10 years in the making. Could you tell me a little bit more about where you will be 10 years from now? What is the plan for Terviva? If there's anyone that knows, based on this conversation and other conversations, it's you, what you're going to be doing 10 years from now or over the next 10 years.
Yeah, another fascinating question, Varun. And let me just say first, what's so pivotal to driving transformation, environmental and social transformation in food and agriculture, is building the ecosystem. So I want to give you and GFI a tremendous amount of credit for what you are doing to convene this dialogue. It is absolutely vital to have us all talking and to support the development of this ecosystem, which you and GFI have done just an amazingly remarkable job of. And so glad to be partnered with you here. Second thing is, we have big ambitions, and it's not driven by money, and it's not driven by commercial interests. It's driven by this desire to transform our food system as rapidly as possible so that we're prepared for this climate constrained world. We're prepared for the increasing amount of demand for healthy and nutritious food that people will want to consume all around the world. And we have a big belief that the closer we can bring food production back to the farmers and back to the regions in which it's being produced, the better off we're all going to be, right? So in the case of Pongamiya and India, we know there are hundreds of millions of trees being grown. We know there are hundreds of thousands of tons of beans being harvested and used. We would like to see, and I would say we, the broadest sense, GFI and Terviva and anybody else who's going to join us on this journey would like to see all of that Pangamiya being used for food, being delivered to the consumer as something that's affordable and tasty and helps decarbonize the food and ag supply chain. There is, of course, a bigger opportunity to get even more Pangamiya in the ground. And Terviva's belief is that we should continue to do that in a very responsible way. We don't want to see Pangamiya going into the most prime agricultural land that you can find. It's not what the tree does today. It's not necessary, right? We can continue to methodically expand Pangamiya plantings on these types of marginal soils, leave the prime soils for all the other fruits and vegetables that we all love to eat that need that soil, and allow Pangamiya to grow in larger and larger amounts on this other land, so that we can go from this 100,000, 500,000 tons of Pangamiya to 5 million tons of Pangamiya, right? There, at that level, we're going to be 25% or more of India's palm oil usage on the vegetable oil side. And I don't want to get into all the details there, but I think we all know that there's better options for the Indian consumer than palm oil, both nutritionally and food security wise, right? So I think the possibilities are endless. It has to happen through a partnership approach. We have to work with people. We have to be leveraging the strengths of others and coordinating, much like GFI has coordinated our broad plant protein ecosystem. Terviva has to curate and coordinate the Pangamiya ecosystem and bring in partners along, and hopefully we do it as well as you've done so far.
Naveen, such a pleasure having this conversation with you. Thank you very much for your time and for being with us at the Smart Protein Summit.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Over the last decades, the last centuries really, humans have had a sort of extractive relationship with nature. We've had this kind of agreement with nature where we've relied on it to get all the things that we need, whether it's fuels, materials, and of course, food. But especially within the last decade, our extraction of those resources from nature has ramped up to a level that has brought us to the point where we are today. It's brought us to a global pandemic. It's brought us to climate crises. It's brought us to indigenous populations being disadvantaged on their own land. And it's brought us to scarcity. If we're going to transition away from this scarcity and move towards abundance over the next decade, we really need to think about reimagining the way our food is made. And we need to think in terms of paradigm shifts, as we've been discussing throughout the entire Smart Protein Summit, and we'll continue to do so over the next several days. The work that Naveen and Terviva are doing is a huge example or a case study of how we can get there. And we're incredibly excited to work with people like him. And I encourage everyone in the audience to think through if there are opportunities for partnership with companies like Terviva, or if you're interested in building companies like this as well. I look forward to having you at the further sessions of the Smart Protein Summit and wish you a good day as you listen to the rest of the sessions now. Thank you.